This is the story of how tennis's biggest advocacy group used Coco Gauff's voice without her permission, got publicly embarrassed, then quietly erased her from their lawsuit. It's a tale of good intentions, terrible execution, and why even tennis reform can't escape tennis politics. Today we're breaking down the PTPA lawsuit saga and what it reveals about power, consent, and the fight for tennis's future. March 18, 2025, the Professional Tennis Players Association drops a bombshell, a 162-page lawsuit against tennis's governing bodies, calling them a cartel that exploits players. The document quotes Coco Gauff, Carlos Alcaraz, and Iga Swiatek criticizing tennis schedules and revenue sharing. There's just one problem: none of them knew they were being quoted in a federal lawsuit.
Using someone's public statements in legal documents without their consent creates immediate credibility issues. The PTPA essentially put words in these players' mouths in a federal court filing. When your advocacy organization can't even get consent from the people you claim to represent, it undermines your entire argument about representing player interests.
The reaction was swift and brutal. Carlos Alcaraz at the Miami Open: "I wasn't aware of it. I honestly don't support that letter." Coco Gauff: "I found out when everyone else did." Iga Swiatek: "I wasn't really involved or asked." These aren't just any players, these are Grand Slam champions publicly distancing themselves from an organization claiming to fight for their rights.
This is Tennis Politics 101. You never speak for players without asking them first. I've seen this mistake destroy campaigns before. When Coco says, "I found out when everyone else did," that's not just embarrassing for the PTPA, it's devastating. How can you claim to represent player voices when you don't even talk to the players?
Here's what the PTPA got right: the issues are real. Players receive roughly 20% of tournament revenues compared to 50% in the NBA and NFL. Tennis calendar is brutal: 11 months with minimal recovery time. Prize money distribution is unequal. These are legitimate problems that Coco, Alcaraz, and Swiatek have all criticized publicly. The PTPA just chose the worst possible way to make their case.
The irony is staggering. The PTPA filed a lawsuit claiming tennis organizations suppress player voices and don't treat players as equal partners. Then they proved that point by suppressing player agency and not treating star players as equal partners in their own advocacy effort. They became what they were fighting against.
What bothers me most is how they used Coco specifically. She's always been thoughtful about tennis issues, advocating for change while being respectful to the sport. Then some organization puts her name in a federal lawsuit without asking. That's not advocacy, that's exploitation. No wonder she distanced herself.
Fast forward to June 25, 2025, just yesterday. The PTPA quietly files an updated complaint. Gone are the quotes from Gauff, Alcaraz, and Swiatek. No fanfare, no explanation, just a silent erasure of the players whose voices they borrowed without permission. It's the legal equivalent of "never mind, we didn't say that."
This removal tells us everything. The PTPA realized their mistake and tried to quietly fix it, but the damage was done. Tennis insider John Wortham called their failure to involve top players problematic for the sport. When you're supposed to represent players but can't get support from the biggest names, what's your credibility worth?
Here's the bigger problem: the PTPA still has only 14 named plaintiffs, and none are top-tier stars. Novak Djokovic co-founded the organization, but isn't even a plaintiff in his own lawsuit. The people with the most power to create change, Gauff, Alcaraz, Swiatek, Sinner, are all staying away. That's not a coincidence.
The PTPA's fundamental problem is they're trying to force change through confrontation while the stars prefer collaboration. Coco and others want better revenue sharing and schedule improvements, but they're working within the system. The PTPA's approach: lawsuits, public attacks, using quotes without permission, alienates the very people they need most.
Let's be clear about Coco's position. She's consistently advocated for change: better revenue sharing, improved conditions, more player representation. At the Miami Open, she said, "I guess the biggest thing would be more of a percentage of the revenue in prize money." She wants reform, just not through an organization that uses her voice without asking.
The tennis world is talking about this quietly. Players are saying, if the PTPA can't even get permission to quote us, how can they negotiate on our behalf? It's created a trust deficit that goes beyond this lawsuit. The organization meant to represent players is now seen as speaking for players rather than with them.
The tragedy is that tennis does need reform. The revenue sharing is unfair, the schedule is brutal, player representation is limited. But the PTPA's tactics have made it harder, not easier, to achieve those goals. When you burn bridges with the stars who could actually drive change, you've defeated your own purpose.
The updated lawsuit focuses more on antitrust violations and governance structures, probably a smarter legal strategy. But the damage to the PTPA's reputation may be irreversible. How do you recover from publicly misrepresenting the very people you claim to champion? How do you build trust after breaking it so completely?
This case will likely be remembered more for its procedural failures than its legal arguments. The PTPA had valid points about tennis's structure, but they undermined their credibility through poor execution. In advocacy, how you make your case is often more important than the case itself. They failed the how spectacularly.
Meanwhile, tennis continues its behind-the-scenes reform discussions. Top players are meeting with Grand Slam organizers about revenue sharing. The ATP and WTA are discussing governance changes. Real progress might be happening through quiet diplomacy, while the PTPA fights in court. Sometimes the loudest voice in the room accomplishes the least.
What I respect about Coco is that she stood her ground. She wants change, but on her terms with her consent in her voice. The PTPA tried to co-opt her advocacy, and she said, "No, that's not how this works." That's leadership, knowing when to say no even to people claiming to fight for your cause.
The lesson here is simple. Authentic advocacy requires authentic consent. You can't represent someone without their permission, even if you agree on the issues. The PTPA forgot that the how of advocacy matters as much as the what. Coco and the other stars reminded them of that lesson the hard way.
PTPA's quiet removal of star complaints from their updated lawsuit isn't just a legal strategy, it's an admission of failure. They had to erase the voices they borrowed without permission because those voices rejected being borrowed. It's a powerful reminder that in advocacy, consent isn't optional, it's everything.
This saga will likely become a case study in advocacy ethics. The PTPA had legitimate grievances and good intentions, but they violated the fundamental principle of representation. You must actually represent the people you claim to speak for. That means getting their consent, not just borrowing their words.
As tennis moves forward, the real reform will likely come from the quiet conversations, not the loud lawsuits. Players like Coco Gauff will continue advocating for change, better revenue sharing, improved schedules, stronger representation. But they'll do it their way with their consent in their voice. The PTPA learned too late that borrowed voices can't create lasting change. The story of how tennis used Coco Gauff's voice without permission, then quietly erased her, is really a story about power, consent, and the right way to create change. PTPA thought they could speak for players without asking. The players led by Coco's principled response proved them wrong. Sometimes the most powerful advocacy is simply saying, "No, not like this." Tennis reform will happen, but it will happen with player consent, not despite it. The lawsuit continues, but the real lesson is already clear. Authentic voices can't be borrowed, they can only be earned.